Friends, I am Vitaly Portnikov, the chairman of the Commission on Counteracting Hybrid Threats of the Azerbaijani Milli Majlis, thought Ramid Namazov stated that Russia is behind the cyber attack on Azerbaijan in February 2025. At a public hearing dedicated to cyber attacks and threats to Azerbaijan's national security, the deputy stated that the attack against Azerbaijani media on February 20th was carried out by the cyber group ART-29, which observers link to Russian military intelligence. The activities of this group, which is engaged in cyber espionage, are primarily directed against government structures, foreign diplomatic missions, as well as the political, defense, energy, media sectors, and other critical areas, noted Namazov, expressing regret over Russia's involvement in the ORK cyber attack. He explained this strike from the Russian Federation as a response to Azerbaijan's decision to close the Russian house in Baku due to this Russian institution's violation of Azerbaijani law, known for its destabilizing influence in the countries where Rosotrudnichestvo has offices. Additionally, Namazov also cited the closure of the Azerbaijani branch of the Russian propaganda radio, Sputnik, as a possible reason for this attack. Thus, Baku has acknowledged for the first time that Russia is capable of conducting large-scale cyber attacks against Azerbaijan, and that these attacks may be orchestrated by Russian security agencies. And this attack itself, considering that Azerbaijan was able to identify its source, could primarily be a signal from Russia towards the neighboring country. A signal that they did not particularly want to hide or disguise, so that the Azerbaijani leadership would understand what further actions the Kremlin might take if President of Azerbaijan Ilham Aliyev does not heed these signals from Vladimir Putin. Thus, it can be clearly observed that Russia is ready to act towards Azerbaijan in exactly the same way as it would towards any other former Soviet republic. The respect for the Azerbaijani leadership, associated with a certain commonality of political regimes, and the desire to stabilize the situation in the region is nothing more than an illusion, which one can, of course, indulge in, but which crumbles against the reality of Russian behavior in a critical moment. We well remember that the very story of the closure of the Russian house occurred after the catastrophe of the Azerbaijani plane, which was shot down in Russian airspace, which, by the way, Russia also wanted to conceal by redirecting the emergency aircraft into the airspace of neighboring Kazakhstan. And after that, there were no apologies from Moscow, no explanations regarding the involvement of Russian security forces in the destruction of the Azerbaijani plane. In other words, Russia behaved, in this case, as it usually does. Such behavior, which in Azerbaijan was considered not just unusual, but provocative, possibly because it was directly aimed against the sovereignty of this country and the sense of self-respect of its leadership, could not help but provoke an irritated reaction from President Ilham Aliyev. And when, after Aliyev's statement that Russia could have behaved differently in the case of this catastrophe, no, conclusions were drawn in Moscow, and there was no meaningful reaction that could be perceived as a real apology from the Russian leaders. Azerbaijan took the following steps. In particular, the closure of the Rosotrudnichestvo office, known as the Russian House. Although it is clear that in Baku they previously understood what activities this office was actually engaged in within the Azerbaijani capital and the purpose of the presence of Russian house employees or Azerbaijani citizens who are employees of such organizations. Recently, as we know, one of the employees of the Russian house in Kyrgyzstan was detained precisely because she was recruiting citizens of this country to participate in Russia's war against Ukraine. And this is just a small part of the destabilizing efforts undertaken by Russian special services under the guise of the Russian house. As we can see, Moscow immediately drew conclusions from President Aliyev's statement, the decision to close the Russian house, and the decision to shut down Radio Sputnik. This conclusion was manifested in the form of a demonstrative cyber attack against Azerbaijan. I think this will not be the last such cyber attack. Further destabilizing actions from the Russian Federation will follow. And of course, no visits to Red Square on May 9th will offset these destabilizing actions. Because Putin wants the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, and other Azerbaijani leaders to feel like leaders of a union republic, obliged to heed Moscow's wishes and under no circumstances criticize the higher leadership. The point is that for the Kremlin, the leaders of the former Soviet republics remain as the first secretaries of the Central Committee of the Republican Communist parties, who cannot, even in their thoughts, equate themselves with the General Secretary in the Russian capital. And any deviation from this rule must be punished, if not with a real war, as in the case of Ukraine, which Putin hates precisely because of the many years of efforts to establish control over this country and the failures in attempts to establish this control, at the very least with cyber attacks, as has happened now with Azerbaijan. And it is clear that mere regret will not suffice here. And the solution lies exclusively in a sovereign foreign policy that will not take into account Russian wishes and demands, but will interpret the relations between Russia and Azerbaijan as relations between two sovereign states. No matter how unpleasant this may sound to Putin and many of his compatriots. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to my social networks, to the channels on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatello, which help develop these products. Use the sponsorship feature on YouTube itself. Peace to you.